somebody of what mankind would call an incurable disease. Do you think God could take somebody who is on death's door and suddenly heal them to where they have no problem? I think we'd all say yes. But let me ask that again. Do you really, truly believe it? How many of you ever went on a wooden bridge in a car? Anybody ever driven a wooden bridge? How many of you, when you went on that bridge, were somewhat apprehensive about going across the bridge? I was. I'll be honest with you. Okay? How many of you have went and bought used furniture from a store? And when you got home, particularly a chair, made sure it was sturdy. About a year ago, I put a swing up on our front porch. Now, I'm not going to lie, I can do things like that, but I'm not 100% confident. And I remember my mom, who I'd called to talk, she's asked about the swing. How do you get a picture? She said, have you said it? And I said, no. She said, why? Because I don't want to break it. I lacked the confidence that I needed. Let me ask you this. Anybody ever teach somebody to drive? Okay, how many of you put on some extra protection just in case? As a driver's ed teacher, I would never teach a kid to drive unless I had what they called those emergency brakes on the passenger side. I can tell you, there were many times my foot sat on that brake just waiting. Have you ever had a belief that was somewhat passive? In other words, you weren't quite sure in what you were believing. It's one thing for us to say, sure, we believe God can do anything. But my question is, do you really believe it? I always think of, and I'm sure many of us older can remember, the movie called Oh God that came out in the 70s with John Denver and George Burns. There's a scene, now whether you like the movie or not, but there's a scene that's very poignant to today's sermon. It's when they put God on trial. Or actually, John Denver's character was on trial. And he said, as a witness, he's doing his own attorney, he said, I want to call God as a witness. And you could just watch the courtroom froze. The judge, everybody just kind of stopped for a moment. And then a few seconds later, I think everybody started laughing. But he said, everybody at that moment, did you not turn to look to see? There was not part of you that said, he's going to show up? Think about in your own life today. Have you ever prayed a prayer? And we always end prayers, but not my will, but thy will be done. I'm not suggesting we shouldn't say that. But have you ever prayed for something so fervently that you expected it to happen? You know, I've learned in my life that God's going to do what God wants in His will. It doesn't mean the things that happen to me through God's will or things I may necessarily like at this moment, but benefit me down the road. Not just on earth, but particularly in heaven. But there are times in my life when I've prayed something, and I've prayed, but the fervency wasn't there. There was unbelief, because I wasn't quite sure. There's always that moment in our lives when we're confronted with a situation to where we turn to God for prayer. But like wading in ponds that you cannot see the bottom, you're not sure what you're going to step on. Or like going to a restaurant with a friend who says, try this dish. You look at the dish, you go, I have no clue what that is, but I'm going to trust him. There's that moment when you have a doubt. But there's also that moment when you have a belief. You know it's going to happen. I'm not going to sit here and tell you if you know somebody yourself are sick, whether it's a dreaded disease or just some kind of illness. I'm not going to sit here and say, I will heal you, because I can't. I know a lot of you see people on television that do these healing services and whatever. I'm not degrading them or saying anything bad. I'm saying This is about faith. Or more accurately, the touch of the Master's hand. There's a poem that I had on my phone. I can't bring it up. But it was actually a song that I remember hearing back in 1986 or 87 called The Touch of the Master's Hand, sung by Wayne Watson based on a poem. And in this poem, there's an auction taking place. And they get to the very end. It's a hot day like it was yesterday in the afternoon. The sun's beginning to go down. People are getting restless, ready to go. The auctioneer picks up the last thing to be sold. It's an old violin. It's dusty. You can tell the strings haven't been tightened up. It's worn. He begins to do his cadence. Says, $1, give me one. Who'll give me two? $2, who'll give me three? Well, then the audience begins restless and nobody's bidding on it. Then all of a sudden, at the very back of the room, this gray-haired man comes forward. He picks up the violin. He picks up the bow. He begins to clean it off. He begins to take the dust off. He tightens up the strings. Makes it look almost brand new. Then he begins to play that violin. He begins to play it. And the music coming out of that violin is melodious. The crowd begins to enthuse. They look at this. They're stunned because they looked at an instrument that looked worthless. Yet it was now playing beautiful music. Then the auctioneer began to go. It says, who will give me 1,000? Who'll give me 2? Maybe 3. In other words, the increase of that violin had increased. And then the audience began to say, what made the change in the price? We went from $1 to $2 to $3 to thousands. It was the touch of the Master's hand. And I want us to think about this today. And those that may be watching on YouTube, understand this. Whatever problem you're going through in your life, whatever situation you may be going through, I'm telling you right now, just as sure as I'm standing here, that God can touch and cure things and change things. He can change people's hearts. All it takes is a touch. Now, if you would turn your Bibles to Matthew chapter 9. Matthew chapter 9. We're looking at verse 18 through 22. You've heard me mention this lady before. You've heard me talk about this. You've heard me talk about the series, The Chosen. In doing my research for this sermon, I went back to that video and looked up things about this woman. And two things struck me as important. Her determination, her faith really stands out. Let me look background. Jesus is going through the city, and the crowds are swelling. People or throngs are following him. He is basically, when he's walking down the street, almost shoulder to shoulder with his disciples, perhaps his bodyguards, if you'd call them, protecting him. People just wanting to touch, wanting to see the Messiah. This lady was sick. She had a blood disorder. She had spent countless amount of money on trying to be cured, going to several physicians, and nobody could give her a rhyme or reason as to why it's happening, because obviously at the time there was no ways to check things out the way we have today. Modern medicine has improved that, but she's going through this problem. Now, as she's going through this physical ailment, by all accounts, she was not a bad person. Not an evil person, but because she was going through this situation, this disease, her family, friends, the entire city had shunned her. Anytime they saw her, they went to the other side of the street and said, she is unclean. There's a reason why she's having this problem. Because she's done something wrong. Excuse me just a second. In other words, because she was afflicted, she must have done something wrong. It's a shame that people sometimes equate physical ailment with sin and saying, because you're going through these problems, you must have done something against God. There's an old expression, when bad things happen to good people, and that's applicable here. She's shunned. Anytime people saw her, they went away from her, much like a leper. And so all these people are getting around Jesus. Jesus is on his way to heal somebody. And people want to see what's happening. This woman who's off to the side, people perhaps yelling at her to leave. She's unclean. She's not worthy. Much like that fiddle, nobody wants to be around. But she begins to think, I need to see him. Look with me in verse 18. While he spake these things, behold, there was a certain ruler and worshipped him, saying, My daughter is even now dead, but come and lay thy hand upon her, and she shall live. Now, let me point something out here. This is not the woman, but this comes into the context of this sermon. All he said was, she's dead. Please come heal her. Think about that. This is not one of those, hey, see if you can help her out. See if you can give us a comforting word. He said, come heal her. He said, lay thy hand on her, she shall live. The touch of the Master's hand. You see, people had understood Jesus' miracles, from Lazarus to turning the water into wine. All these things they'd heard about happening. All these things, the Messiah. So they knew, even those that may not be Jewish, even those that may not be religious, they understood about Jesus. If you will just come and do something, lay your hand on her, she will be healed. Now, it goes on, and Jesus arose and followed him, and so did his disciples. And this is where the throng of people watching, they hear this ruler say, come heal my daughter. All you got to do is put your hand on her, and she'll be healed. Now, a lot of us have been around a loved one that's been sick, particularly a little child. There's nothing worse as a parent than when your little child, baby, is sick and can't do anything about it. And you go to the doctor and you ask them to do something. Almost all the time they check for any problems, then they do a prescription and send you home. I'm not saying that's bad, but that's kind of how the routine is. Because I will tell you this, as wonderful as physicians may be today, as wonderful as medication has advanced, there's no healer like God. This not even close. Kind of an aside, I will tell you this. My oldest son Jacob was what we call a high-risk pregnancy. And at one point during the pregnancy, we were told to consider options. And I'll leave it at that. But I remember we were trying to determine a name even before we went to Baylor Hospital. And Baylor Hospital in Dallas, if you've never been to Dallas, it's in not so nice neighborhood, but a wonderful place. And we were there, we were talking to some of the nurses. And they said, we see miracles all the time. Long story short, we were sitting there and we saw a pamphlet that said, blessed is the God of Jacob. And that's where we got the name. A child that was not supposed to be born, or when he was born was supposed to have all these. Folks, I will tell you, in that room he was born, there were 20 to 28 doctors and nurses ready to whisk that baby once he was born to the emergency room to have surgery. I'll never forget what the doctor's name was Dr. Payne, by the way. I'll never forget what he said. He took the baby, they did some tests, put him in the incubator, and said, this baby is healthy. Prayers have been lifted up. Yes, there were doubts in my wife and my heart. We didn't know. But one thing I do know. There's a God that can do things that mankind cannot fathom. There's a peace beyond understanding that man does not know. But look what it says here. And go on. And behold, a woman which was diseased with an issue of blood 12 years came behind him and touched the hem of his garment. For she said within herself, if I may but touch his garment, I shall be whole. Look at this. All I need is a touch of the Master, and I will be made whole. Two examples here. The rich ruler who said, come and touch your hand on my daughter and she'll be healed. The woman who's had sick for 12 years, knowing she's been to physicians. If a doctor's in here listening alive, this is not to demean anybody, but there is no physician like Jesus Christ. No matter how good the medications are, how skilled a physician may be. And don't get me wrong, they're very skilled. Nobody can heal like Jesus Christ. She said, all I got to do is touch his garment. In the show, The Chosen, the scene, and I encourage you to look at this. This woman is pushing through people with her hand out in slow motion saying, I just need to touch his garment. And she falls and touches his garment. And in that moment, Jesus stops. He says, somebody touched me. I felt my power leave. And he turned and said, who did this? Now think about this. All the things he's done, he had to question who did. He knew who did it. But he wanted to see would that person, would they show their faith publicly? And it says here, he saw her and he said, now let me, before going on, what we know is that she was there. I don't want to say she was ashamed. But he said, who touched me? And she said, I did, Lord. And she told him, said, all I knew is if I touched your garment, I would be healed. I've had this disease for 12 years. Nobody else can help me. Nobody can cure me. Oh, they've tried. I spent almost all my savings trying to find something to help me feel better. Nothing seems to work. But I knew, when as soon as I heard you're coming to town, I risked coming in, alienating people yelling at me, mocking me, and trying to run me out of town. I knew if I could just touch your garment, I would be made whole. If it was just the touch of the Master's hand. See, she could have done it silently and then walked on. But her profession here, if I could just touch, look what Jesus said. Daughter, be of good comfort. In other words, it's okay. Thy faith has made thee whole. The woman was made whole that hour. Now, and I talked about the poem a while ago, and I read this. I'm not going to tell you that God will cure every problem you have. One of his disciples, they called Little John, supposedly suffered from diseases. And he had to sit back and watch Jesus cure other people, on and on and on. Yet he kept going through his diseases. But if you go look, Jesus said to him, he said, the reason I haven't cured you is because you're not cured, yet you still follow me. You have not been made whole, yet you still remain faithful. Think of that testimony. Now, I'm not going to try to scare you and say, hey, if you're going through some problems and Jesus doesn't cure you, he may not cure you just for a reason. Just understand this. If you're going through some kind of problem, a physical ailment, financial problem, any kind of circumstances you're going through, take it to Jesus. If you're somebody that doesn't know Jesus as your Lord and Savior, let me just tell you something. He listens to everybody. He hears every prayer, even from a non-believer. He listens to them because he loves you. He cares for you deeply. Take it to him. I'm not going to sit here and tell you that if you take this sickness that you have or somebody has, God's going to cure it. I mentioned my uncle a while ago. I don't know what's going to happen. But there's something about faith in Jesus and trusting him. See, we're all like that fiddle, that violin, that the world has cast aside. You're not worth anything anymore. You have no value. You cannot be used for anything. But all it takes is the touch of the Master's hand. And though what may be perceived as unclean can be made whole. What can be made looked as useless becomes a key configure in the sharing of the gospel. Think of the Apostle Paul. Jesus took a murderer and changed his heart. Think of all the disciples. He took them and their baggage and turned them into something that today, even more famous than the Beatles, they are more famous in the impact they've had in this world. Because all it took is a touch of the Master's hand. Let's stand, please. Page 307. Page 307. Just as